There's a private island off the coast of Georgia. In 1910, this island was home to one of the most exclusive clubs on the planet. Munsey's magazine described it as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. Its members included the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, families whose combined fortunes could buy entire nations. And in November of that year, 6 men arrived on that island under the cover of night, using fake names, pretending to be on a duck hunting trip. One of them even carried a borrowed shotgun just to keep up appearances, but they didn't fire a single round. They weren't there to hunt ducks. They were there to redesign the entire financial architecture of the United States. And what they built on that island didn't just reshape American banking. It gave the country the machinery to fund the most devastating war the world had ever seen up to that point. A war that killed somewhere around 20 million people, collapsed 4 empires, and rearranged the map of the modern world. The institution they created is still standing. You know it as the Federal Reserve. And the story of how it came into existence reads less like economics and more like a conspiracy thriller, because the men who designed it understood something that most people didn't. Whoever controls the money supply controls the country. And in 1910, a handful of private bankers decided that they should be the ones doing the controlling. But to understand why these men felt the need to sneak off to a private island in the dead of night, you first need to understand what America looked like before the Federal Reserve existed. Because the picture is far more chaotic than most people realize. Between 1863 and 1910, the United States experienced at least 3 major banking panics, and as many as 8 additional localized ones, depending on which historians you ask. The economy would boom, credit would expand, people would invest recklessly, and then the whole thing would collapse. Banks would fail, people would lose their savings overnight, businesses would shutter. And there was no safety net, no central authority to step in, stabilize things, and prevent a total financial meltdown. The United States was, at that point, one of the only major industrialized nations on Earth without a central bank. Britain had the Bank of England, France had the Banque de France, Germany had the Reichsbank, and America had nothing. Just a patchwork of thousands of independent banks, each holding its own reserves, each vulnerable to panic, and each incapable of helping the others when things went sideways. Now the country had tried central banking before. Twice, actually. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, established the first Bank of the United States in 1791. It functioned reasonably well, but when its 20-year charter came up for renewal in 1811, Congress let it die. The agrarian faction of the country, led by Thomas Jefferson's philosophical descendants, believed that a central bank concentrated too much power in the hands of too few people. They had a deep-seated, almost visceral distrust of centralized financial authority, and honestly, who could blame them? The country had literally fought a revolution to escape the grip of a distant, powerful authority. So the first bank died. And then, almost immediately, the country plunged into the War of 1812, and the government struggled mightily to finance it. Suddenly, the wisdom of having a central bank didn't seem so abstract. So Congress established the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. It ran for 20 years, doing more or less what it was supposed to do, until Andrew Jackson came along and killed it. Jackson saw the Second Bank as a monster, a corrupt institution that served the interests of Eastern bankers at the expense of ordinary Americans. He vetoed its recharter in 1832, and by 1836, the Second Bank of the United States was gone. And for the next 77 years, America operated without any central banking authority whatsoever. Now here's the thing about running a massive, rapidly industrializing economy without a central bank. It works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, it doesn't just stumble. It falls off a cliff. The panic of 1893 was devastating. Over 500 banks failed. Unemployment surged above 10% nationally, and in some industrial cities it was closer to 25%. Railroads, the backbone of the American economy, went bankrupt at an alarming rate. Something like a quarter of the nation's railroad mileage ended up in receivership. The human suffering was immense, and the government, which had no real tools to address a financial crisis of that magnitude, was essentially helpless. But the panic that really changed everything, the one that finally convinced the power brokers of America that something fundamental needed to change, was the Panic of 1907. And the story of that panic starts, of all places, with an earthquake. In April of 1906, a massive earthquake devastated San Francisco. The destruction was so widespread that British insurance companies had to pay out enormous claims. And to do that, they needed gold. So gold started flowing out of the United States and back to London. The Bank of England, watching its gold reserves dip, raised interest rates to attract more gold back, and that tightening of monetary policy in London sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Credit conditions in the United States tightened. The stock market, which had been on a speculative tear, began to slide. Between September 1906 and March 1907, markets fell roughly 8%. And then, In May 1907, the American economy officially tipped into recession. Things got worse that autumn. In October, a speculator named F. Augustus Heinze and his associate Charles Morse attempted to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. It was a reckless gamble, and it failed spectacularly. When the scheme collapsed, it triggered a crisis of confidence that rippled outward through the entire banking system. Depositors panicked. They started lining up outside of banks and trust companies demanding their money. Some of these lines stretched around city blocks. People were showing up at 3 and 4 in the morning, terrified that if they waited any longer, there wouldn't be anything left. Now, the critical thing to understand about this moment is that the trust companies were at the center of the storm. Trust companies were these financial institutions that operated almost like banks, but with far less regulation. They competed aggressively for deposits, offered higher interest rates, and made riskier investments. But they were not members of the New York Clearinghouse, which was the closest thing the country had to a banking safety net. So when depositors panicked and started pulling their money out of the trusts, there was no institutional mechanism to save them. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest trust companies in New York, was the first major domino to fall. Its president, Charles Barney, had connections to the failed copper scheme, and once that news hit the streets, depositors flooded the bank demanding withdrawals. The National Bank of Commerce, which had been clearing checks for Knickerbocker, announced that it would stop doing so. That was the death knell. Knickerbocker collapsed on October 22, 1907, after paying out almost $8 million in a matter of hours. The panic spread from there. The ripple effects didn't stay in New York. Banks across the country began hoarding cash, refusing to make loans. In Pittsburgh, a major bank collapsed. In Providence, Rhode Island, depositors besieged their local savings institutions. In the heartland, farmers couldn't get credit to move their crops to market. The entire financial system was seizing up, like a body going into shock, and there was no central authority with the power or the resources to stop the bleeding. The stock market hemorrhaged value. At one point during the crisis, the rate on overnight call loans, the short-term money that fueled daily trading on the New York Stock Exchange, spiked to nearly 50%. Trading very nearly ground to a halt. If the stock exchange had been forced to close, the consequences would have cascaded through every sector of the American economy. And this is where one man steps into the breach, a man whose personal power and influence essentially substituted for a central bank. That man was John Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan was 70 years old in October 1907. He was attending a church conference in Richmond, Virginia, when news of the crisis reached him. He rushed back to New York and set up a command center in the library of his brownstone mansion on Madison Avenue. For the next 3 weeks, the most powerful bankers in America rotated through that library, seeking Morgan's guidance, his approval, and above all, his money. Morgan personally examined the books of failing institutions. He decided which ones were worth saving and which ones were not. He organized syndicates of bankers to pool their resources and inject cash into the system. He convinced John D. Rockefeller to deposit $10 million into the Union Trust Company to shore up confidence. He persuaded the Secretary of the Treasury to deposit over $37 million in federal funds into the national banks. He even got the mayor of New York to come to him for help when the city itself was on the verge of bankruptcy, and Morgan underwrote $30 million in city bonds. And at the most critical moment of the crisis, on the night of November 2nd, Morgan literally locked a group of trust company executives inside his library and refused to let them leave until they agreed to contribute to a $25 million rescue pool. They signed the agreement at 4 in the morning. Morgan saved the banking system. There is no serious dispute about that. But his intervention also revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the American financial system. The economic stability of the most powerful nation on earth had just depended on the personal judgment, the personal wealth, and the personal willingness of one 70-year-old man. If Morgan had been too sick to act, or too old, or simply unwilling, the entire system might have collapsed. The country's financial fate had rested in the hands of a single private citizen who was accountable to no one but himself. And that scared people. It scared politicians. It scared ordinary Americans. And perhaps most importantly, it scared the bankers themselves, because even they knew that the system was unsustainable. Morgan wouldn't live forever. And the next time a panic hit, there might not be anyone with the resources or the reputation to save the country from economic oblivion. The aftermath of the 1907 panic ignited a firestorm of public debate. Progressives like Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin began railing against what he called the money trust, an alleged cartel of Wall Street bankers who controlled the nation's credit and manipulated markets for their own benefit. In 1912, the House Banking Committee launched the Pujo investigation, named after its chairman Arsen Pujo of Louisiana, which hauled the titans of Wall Street before Congress to explain their practices. Morgan himself was called to testify. The investigation confirmed what many Americans already suspected, that a small interlocking network of bankers exerted extraordinary influence over American industry and finance. The committee found that Morgan and his associates held 341 directorships in 112 corporations, with combined resources of over $22 billion. The concentration of financial power was staggering, and the public outcry for reform was deafening. So Congress acted. In 1908, in the immediate aftermath of the panic, lawmakers passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which created the National Monetary Commission. Its job was to study the banking systems of the world's major economies and come up with a plan to reform the American system. And the man put in charge of this commission was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island. Now, Nelson Aldrich is a fascinating and deeply complicated figure. He was born into modest circumstances in Foster, Rhode Island in 1841. His father was a mill hand. Aldrich worked his way up from a grocery clerk to become a partner in a wholesale grocery firm, and then he parlayed that into a political career that would make him one of the most powerful men in Washington. By the turn of the century, Aldrich was essentially the uncrowned king of the United States Senate. He controlled the Republican caucus on domestic policy with an iron grip. Theodore Roosevelt, who was the President of the United States, and not a man who was easily impressed, once admitted to a journalist that he bowed to Aldrich, that he talked to Aldrich, and that he respected Aldrich more than Aldrich respected him. But Aldrich's power didn't come just from political skill. It came from his relationships. Specifically, his relationship with the two most powerful financial dynasties in America. Aldrich was widely regarded as, to use the phrase of the era, the authentic voice of J.P. Morgan in the Senate. And if that weren't enough, his daughter Abigail married John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son and heir of the richest man in the world. So when Congress needed someone to study banking reform and come back with a plan, they chose the man who was literally a family member of the Rockefellers and a political ally of the Morgans. The fox was in charge of the hen house, and the hens didn't even know it. Aldrich took his commission seriously. He spent nearly 2 years traveling through Europe, studying the central banks of England, France, and Germany. He met with the most prominent bankers on the continent. He absorbed their ideas, their systems, their philosophies about monetary policy. And when he returned to the United States, he knew that America needed something similar, a central institution that could hold reserves, issue elastic currency, and serve as a lender of last resort during financial crises. The question was how to design it and who to consult. And this is where one of the most remarkable characters in this entire story enters the picture. His name was Paul Moritz Warburg. Warburg was born in Hamburg, Germany, in 1868, into the Warburg family, one of Europe's most prestigious banking dynasties. The family's roots in finance stretched back centuries, with origins tracing to Venice. The family bank, M. Warburg and Company, had been established in 1798 by Paul's great-grandfather. Paul trained in some of the finest financial houses in Europe. He worked in London, in Paris, and then he traveled the world to learn the intricacies of international finance. In 1895, he married Nina Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, who was a founding partner of the powerhouse New York investment firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Now, here's where the web of connections gets interesting. Paul's brother, Felix Warburg, married the daughter of Jacob Schiff, who was the senior partner at Kuhn, Loeb, and one of the most influential financiers in America. Schiff was so powerful that J.P. Morgan himself reportedly acknowledged Schiff as his only equal. So the Warburg brothers married into the Loeb and Schiff families, and through those marriages, they were woven deep into the fabric of American high finance. Paul Warburg arrived in New York in 1902 and was immediately struck by what he considered the primitive state of American banking. Coming from Europe, where sophisticated central banks managed money supplies and smoothed out credit cycles, the chaotic American system seemed almost barbaric to him. Shortly after arriving, he watched in disbelief as interest rates in New York's money market soared to 100% during a seasonal squeeze. He later recalled that he wasn't in the country 3 weeks before he started trying to figure out what was wrong with the system. Warburg wrote a paper advocating for a central bank similar to the German Reichsbank. He showed it to his brother-in-law Jacob Schiff, who passed it along to James Stillman, the head of National City Bank, the largest bank in the country. Stillman visited Warburg, and the two had a testy exchange. Warburg warned that in the next panic, Stillman would regret the absence of a central bank. Stillman left in a huff. Schiff then cautioned Warburg not to show the paper to anyone else. The American people, Schiff explained, do not want to centralize power. They do not want to have this mass of deposits controlled by a few people. Warburg had stumbled onto the oldest argument in American politics, the tension between federal power and local autonomy that had been debated by Hamilton and Jefferson at the very founding of the Republic. But Warburg was persistent, almost maddeningly so. He became the most articulate and relentless advocate for a central bank in America. He wrote papers, gave speeches, and published article after article laying out his vision. In 1907, he published a piece called Defects and Needs of Our Banking System, in the New York Times Annual Financial Review, where he meticulously compared the American system to European models and made the case for reform. He argued before audiences at Columbia University, the American Economic Association, and the Academy of Political Science. He was methodical, precise, and utterly convinced that he was right. When the Panic of 1907 hit just months later, his warnings seemed almost prophetic. Suddenly, the bankers and politicians who had ignored him were paying very close attention. Warburg caught the eye of Senator Aldrich, who by 1908 was heading the National Monetary Commission. Aldrich consulted Warburg on currency reform, and by 1910, Warburg had become one of Aldrich's most trusted advisors on the subject. Their intellectual partnership would culminate in the most secretive and consequential meeting in the history of American finance. On the evening of November 22, 1910, a group of men gathered at a railway terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. They came one at a time, each arriving separately to avoid drawing attention. They boarded a private railroad car that belonged to Senator Aldrich, and they set off on a journey south. Their destination was Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, a private resort so exclusive that its members included some of the wealthiest families in the world. The trip would take them nearly 1,000 miles, and for the entire journey, they used only first names with each other, no last names, no titles. The staff on the train were not to learn who these men were under any circumstances. The group would later refer to themselves as the First Name Club, and they maintained the secret of this meeting for over 20 years. When the journalist B.C. Forbes, founder of Forbes magazine, somehow learned about the trip in 1917 and wrote about it, the participants flatly denied that the meeting had ever occurred. Those who noticed the article dismissed it as a mere yarn. It wasn't until the 1930s, after several of the participants published memoirs, that the truth became widely known. So who was on that train? Besides Aldrich himself and his personal secretary Arthur Shelton, the group included Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, one of the most connected men on Wall Street. Davison had started his career as an office boy at a small Connecticut bank and risen through the ranks with such speed that by his mid-30s, he was running the First National Bank of New York. Then J.P. Morgan personally recruited him to join the firm. Davison was Morgan's point man, his fixer, and his representative in the banking reform movement. Then there was Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank of New York, which was essentially the Rockefeller Bank. Vanderlip had an unlikely backstory. He grew up on a farm outside Aurora, Illinois, and after his father died, he took a job in a machine shop to support his family. He worked his way into journalism, became the financial editor of the Chicago Tribune, and eventually caught the attention of the banking world. He rose rapidly through the Treasury Department and then the banking industry, eventually landing at the helm of what would become one of the largest banks in the country. Next was A. Piet Andrew, who, at the time, held the position of Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Andrew was an academic economist from Harvard who had been appointed Secretary of the National Monetary Commission. He served as a technical bridge between the political and financial worlds, a man with feet in both the Rockefeller and Morgan camps. And then there was Paul Warburg, the German-born banker with the European pedigree and the intimate knowledge of how central banks actually worked. By most accounts, Warburg was the intellectual engine of the Jekyll Island meeting. He directed the proceedings. He drafted the primary features of the plan. He took the abstract concepts of European central banking and translated them into a framework that could work in the American political landscape. For roughly 9 days, these men worked around the clock. They ate their Thanksgiving dinner together on the island, feasting on wild turkey with oyster stuffing. But mostly, they debated, drafted, argued, and refined. The central tension in the room was between Aldrich's instinct to create a straightforward central bank on the European model and Warburg's more politically savvy understanding that the American public would never accept such a thing. Americans had killed 2 central banks already. They were deeply suspicious of concentrated financial power, especially if it was controlled by Wall Street. So Warburg insisted that the plan had to disguise the reality of central control beneath a veneer of decentralization. Instead of one central bank, they would propose a network of regional reserve banks scattered across the country, each with a degree of local governance. It would look like a decentralized system, but in practice, the power would flow upward to a central board, and the major New York banks would wield enormous influence over the whole apparatus. It was, in a very real sense, a central bank designed to not look like a central bank. By the time the group left Jekyll Island, they had produced the draft of what would become known as the Aldrich Plan. It proposed the creation of a National Reserve Association with 15 regional branches, governed by directors drawn from the banking industry. The plan would give this association the power to issue currency, hold reserves, rediscount commercial paper, and serve as a lender of last resort. In other words, everything a central bank does, just wrapped in different packaging. Frank Vanderlip, reflecting on the meeting years later, put it bluntly. He wrote that he felt their secret expedition to Jekyll Island was the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. He He also admitted that they knew discovery simply must not happen because if it were publicly exposed that their particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, the bill would have had no chance of passage through Congress. The secrecy wasn't incidental to the process. It was essential. Now, the Aldrich plan didn't become law directly. The political landscape shifted beneath it. In the 1910 midterm elections, the Democrats won control of the House of Representatives. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency, defeating the incumbent Taft and the third-party candidacy of Theodore Roosevelt, who had split the Republican vote. Aldrich, a staunch Republican, was now politically toxic. His name on the bill was a liability. Progressive Democrats distrusted anything associated with Wall Street, and a bill literally named after the man who was the Senate's most prominent champion of big business was dead on arrival. But here's the thing, the ideas survived. They survived because the underlying architecture was sound, at least from a banking perspective, and because the men behind the plan were patient enough to let someone else take the credit. When Representative Carter Glass and Senator Robert Owen took up banking reform under the Wilson administration, the bill they produced was remarkably similar to the Aldrich plan. Warburg himself later published a line-by-line comparison of the two bills to prove just how close they were. The Owen-Glass bill kept the regional structure, the elastic currency provisions, and the rediscounting mechanisms. The major difference was that in the final Federal Reserve Act, the President of the United States would appoint the members of the Board of Governors, giving it a veneer of democratic accountability that the Aldrich plan had lacked. But the basic architecture, the regional reserve banks, the elastic currency, the rediscounting mechanism, all of it traced back to those 9 days on Jekyll Island. As one banker exulted at the time, the bill recognizes and adopts the principles of a central bank. Wilson needed political support to get the bill passed, and he found it through a complex dance of compromise. He had to win over William Jennings Bryan, the populist hero who distrusted bankers with every fiber of his being. Wilson appointed Bryan as Secretary of State, and then convinced him that because the Federal Reserve notes would be obligations of the government and the president would appoint the governors, the system was sufficiently under public control. Whether Bryan was persuaded or simply outmaneuvered is a question historians still debate. On December 22, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed overwhelmingly by Congress. The very next day, just before Christmas, President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. The Federal Reserve System, conceived in secret on a private island by a handful of the most powerful financiers in the country, was now the law of the land. Paul Warburg was appointed to the first Federal Reserve Board on August 10, 1914. He would eventually rise to the position of vice governor, essentially the second most powerful person in the institution he had helped design. The men from Jekyll Island had won. But here's where the story takes a darker and far more consequential turn. Because the Federal Reserve didn't just reform American banking. It created a machine that could finance war on a scale that had previously been unimaginable. And the first war it would finance was already erupting on the other side of the Atlantic. Just weeks after Warburg took his seat on the Federal Reserve Board, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set off a chain of events that plunged Europe into the First World War. And almost immediately, the new Federal Reserve System found itself at the center of the financial architecture of that conflict. Now, let's be very precise here. The Federal Reserve did not cause World War I. Nobody's arguing that. But the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 and the financial infrastructure it established made it possible for the United States to fund the war effort in a way that would have been extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, under the old system. And the bankers who designed the Federal Reserve were, in many cases, the very same bankers who stood to profit enormously from the war. To understand how this worked, you need to follow the money. And the money trail starts with J.P. Morgan and Company. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, the initial impact on the American economy was actually negative. Financial markets panicked. The New York Stock Exchange shut down for over 4 months, the longest closure in its history. Credit froze. Businesses laid off workers. Factories operated at 60% capacity. Food prices spiked. For a brief terrifying moment, it looked like the European war might drag the United States into a recession comparable to the one that had followed the Panic of 1893. But then the war orders started coming in, and they came in like a flood. Britain and France needed weapons, ammunition, food, raw materials, chemicals, copper, cotton, locomotives, everything you need to sustain a massive industrial war grinding through the mud of Flanders and the forests of Verdun. And the United States, as the world's largest industrial economy and a neutral nation, was the obvious supplier. Almost immediately, the question of who would broker these enormous transactions became critical, and the answer was the House of Morgan. Now, the House of Morgan had deep historical ties to Britain. Morgan's London affiliate, Morgan Grenfell, had been servicing British financial interests for decades. The firm had helped finance the Boer War at the turn of the century. The personal sympathies of J.P. Morgan Jr., who had taken over the firm after his father's death in 1913, were openly pro-British. He later told the Nye Committee, without a trace of apology, that despite President Wilson's urging of impartiality even in thought, he found it quite impossible to be impartial between right and wrong. By right, he meant Britain. In January 1915, the British government signed a commercial agency agreement with J.P. Morgan and Company, designating the bank as the exclusive purchasing agent for all British war material bought in the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. A private American bank became the sole intermediary for one of the largest wartime procurement operations in human history. For this service, Morgan earned a 1% commission on every transaction. When the volume of those transactions eventually exceeded $3 billion in wartime goods, that 1% became a staggering fortune. But the purchasing arrangement was only half the equation. Britain and France also needed to borrow money to pay for all this material. And again, the House of Morgan was the primary intermediary. Morgan organized the largest foreign loan in Wall Street history up to that point, a $500 million bond issue to support the British and French governments. The bank assembled a syndicate of approximately 2,200 banks to underwrite this massive loan. And through its affiliate firm, Morgan Grenfell in London, and Morgan Harges in Paris, the House of Morgan became, in effect, the banker to the entire Allied war effort. The numbers are staggering. By the spring of 1917, when the United States finally entered the war, the British had borrowed approximately $2.7 billion through Morgan and other banking houses. Russia had also chosen Morgan as its intermediary for American borrowings. For all these services, the House of Morgan earned commissions estimated at over $200 million. And many of the companies that received these war production contracts were owned by Morgan holding companies, or were within what historians have described as his orbit of bank control. Now, here is an important detail about the nature of this arrangement. Morgan wasn't just lending money and collecting interest. He was simultaneously serving as the lender and the purchasing agent, which meant money flowed through his hands in both directions. He would extend credit to the Allied governments, and then those governments would immediately spend that credit purchasing war material from American companies, many of which were within Morgan's corporate network. The money went out the front door and came back through the side door. Morgan earned commissions on the loans and commissions on the purchases. It was a financial, perpetual motion machine, and as long as the war continued, the profits continued to compound. Between 1914 and 1917, while the United States was still officially neutral, American industry was booming from war orders. The gross national product climbed roughly 20%. Manufacturing output surged by 40%. The Allied powers purchased over $3 billion in wartime goods from American firms and borrowed over $2 billion in bonds. The American economy was no longer neutral in any meaningful sense. It was a belligerent economy disguised in neutral clothing, feeding one side of the conflict while starving the other. Now, this raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Did the financial entanglement of American banks with the Allied war effort influence the United States' decision to enter the war? The question isn't new. In the 1930s, Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota led a congressional investigation into exactly this issue. The Nye Committee examined whether munitions manufacturers and bankers, who had made enormous profits during the war, had pushed the country into the conflict for their own benefit. The investigation found that between 1915 and January 1917, the United States had loaned Germany approximately $27 million. During the same period, it had loaned Britain, France, and their allies roughly $2.3 billion. That's almost 100 times more money flowing to one side of the conflict. The idea that the United States was genuinely neutral during this period strains credulity when you look at the financial ledger. The historian Niall Ferguson, writing about this period, put it sharply. He noted that by the beginning of 1917, J.P. Morgan was so deeply committed to Britain financially that it was Morgan as much as Britain that was bailed out when the United States entered the war. In other words, by early 1917, the Allies were running out of credit. Private investors could no longer safely loan money to governments that were hemorrhaging cash on the Western Front. If the United States had not entered the war, if the government had not stepped in to guarantee Allied debts, many of the loans that Morgan and other banks had extended might have gone unpaid. The banks would have faced catastrophic losses. And then the Federal Reserve made its move. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the government needed to mobilize financial resources on an unprecedented scale. Federal spending on the military surged 15-fold between 1916 and 1918. The Treasury needed money, and it needed it fast. The solution was the Liberty Bond program, and the Federal Reserve was the engine that made it work. William McAdoo, who served simultaneously as Secretary of the Treasury and as the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, orchestrated the campaign. This dual role is significant. The same man controlled both the government's purse strings and the central bank's monetary levers. McAdoo understood that simply printing money would cause devastating inflation, as it had during the Civil War, So instead, the government would borrow from the public through the sale of Liberty bonds. And the Federal Reserve would facilitate those sales by lending money to banks at preferential rates, allowing them to purchase war bonds and then use those bonds as collateral for further borrowing. The mechanism was elegant and, for the banks, extremely profitable. Congress amended the Federal Reserve Act in 1916 by adding Section 13.8, which for the first time allowed the Federal Reserve to make loans to member banks using government debt as collateral. Then, when the Liberty Bond drives began, the Fed set a preferential discount rate on loans secured by Liberty bonds, a rate that was a full percentage point below the regular discount rate. So a member bank could buy Liberty bonds paying 3.5% interest, then immediately pledge those bonds to the Federal Reserve as collateral for a loan at 3%. The bank pocketed the spread while the government got its money. Taxpayers, meanwhile, paid the interest on the bonds. Over the course of 4 Liberty loan drives and 1 Victory loan drive, the United States government raised roughly $24 billion. In today's terms, adjusted as a share of GDP, that would be equivalent to well over $5 trillion. About half of all American families purchased some form of war bond. But the other half of the total amount was purchased by financial institutions for their own accounts in large denominations of $10,000 or more. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet ballooned. By 1919, loans collateralized by government debt had grown to nearly 100% of all discounts made by the Federal Reserve. The central bank had become, in the words of one economic historian, a sink for government war debt. The scale of the campaigns was extraordinary. For the third Liberty loan alone, 9 million posters were produced, along with 5 million window stickers and 10 million patriotic buttons. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks appeared at rallies to promote bond sales. Army pilots performed air shows over small towns and then offered airplane rides to anyone who purchased a bond. The Army, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, Hollywood, the newspapers, the schools, every institution in American life was mobilized into the service of selling government debt. It was, in a very real sense, the first total war financed by a central bank, and the Federal Reserve performed its role with terrifying efficiency. And here's the part that ties the whole story together. The very men who had designed the Federal Reserve on Jekyll Island in 1910 were, by 1917, the men profiting most handsomely from its wartime operations. Henry Davison, who had represented Morgan at Jekyll Island, was a key figure in coordinating Morgan's war financing activities. Frank Vanderlip, who had represented the Rockefeller interests at Jekyll Island, ran National City Bank, which was one of the 3 leading banks handling Allied war loans. Paul Warburg sat on the Federal Reserve Board itself, overseeing the very institution he had helped design, although his German birth created increasingly awkward complications as anti-German sentiment rose, and he ultimately resigned from the board in August 1918. And here's a detail that makes this story even more surreal. While Paul Warburg was helping the Federal Reserve finance the Allied war effort in the United States, his brother Max Warburg was serving as a financial advisor to the German Kaiser. At the end of the war, Max Warburg attended the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 as part of the German delegation. 2 brothers from the same banking dynasty, on opposite sides of the most destructive war the world had yet seen, each advising their respective governments on matters of finance. The Warburg family bank in Hamburg, M.M. Warburg and Company, continued to operate throughout the conflict. It's a detail that underscores just how intertwined the world of international finance was, even in wartime, and how the boundaries between nations, between allies and enemies, become strangely porous when you follow the money far enough. And the ghost of Senator Aldrich, who had died in 1915, loomed over the entire affair through his family's connections. His grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would go on to become Vice President of the United States. His son, Winthrop Aldrich, would become chairman of Chase National Bank. The connections weren't hidden. They didn't need to be. The system worked exactly as designed. The Federal Reserve provided the monetary infrastructure. The Treasury issued the bonds, the banks facilitated the sales, and earned commissions at every stage. And the war was financed not through direct taxation, which would have required the American people to fully confront the costs of the conflict, but through a sophisticated borrowing mechanism that spread the burden across time and obscured its true cost behind layers of financial engineering. The consequences of this financial architecture extended far beyond the war itself. The Federal Reserve's accommodation of war financing led to significant inflation. Between 1914 and 1920, the money supply roughly doubled. Consumer prices rose sharply. After the war ended, the Fed tightened policy to combat the inflation it had helped create, and the resulting recession of 1920 to 1921 was severe. The wartime debts that the Allies owed to the United States became a source of bitter international disputes throughout the 1920s. The reparations imposed on Germany at the Treaty of Versailles intended in part to help the Allies repay their American creditors. destabilized the German economy, and contributed to the rise of the very extremism that would plunge the world into an even more devastating conflict 2 decades later. And through it all, the Federal Reserve continued to grow in power and influence. It had entered the war as a fledgling institution still finding its footing. It emerged as a major player on the world stage, with a vastly expanded balance sheet, a growing portfolio of government securities, and the expertise and tools necessary to function as a true central bank. The war, in a very real sense, made the Federal Reserve what it is today. Now, none of this is to suggest that there was some grand unified conspiracy to start a world war in order to profit from it. History is rarely that neat. The causes of World War I were complex and multifaceted, rooted in imperial rivalries, ethnic tensions, alliance systems, and a catastrophic failure of diplomacy. The financial entanglements between American banks and the Allied powers were one factor among many in the United States' decision to enter the war, but they were a significant factor. And the infrastructure that enabled those entanglements, the Federal Reserve System itself, was designed and built by the very men who stood to benefit most from them. What makes this story so enduring and so relevant is not just the historical facts, it's the pattern. A small group of enormously powerful people gather in secret, design a system that serves their interests, package it as a public good, and then use that system to finance activities that consolidate their power even further. The specific names change over the decades, the mechanisms evolve, but the underlying dynamic, the relationship between private financial power and public authority, remains remarkably consistent. The Federal Reserve today is an institution of enormous consequence. Its decisions on interest rates affect every mortgage, every car loan, every business investment in the country. Its interventions during the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic were measured in trillions of dollars. And the debates that surround it today about independence from political pressure, about transparency, about who really controls monetary policy, and in whose interest these debates trace directly back to that private railroad car leaving Hoboken in the dark of a November night in 1910. Paul Warburg, the man who arguably did more than anyone else to create the Federal Reserve, dreamed that his creation would be seen like the great cathedrals of Europe, enduring, beautiful, and beloved. Instead, the Fed has been a lightning rod for criticism, suspicion, and conspiracy theories for over a century. And perhaps that's appropriate, because the truth about the Federal Reserve's origins is strange enough on its own without any embellishment. 6 men, representing the greatest concentrations of private wealth in the nation, sneaking off to a private island to write the blueprint for America's central bank, and then lying about it for 20 years. You can't make that up. After the war, the United States was transformed. It entered the conflict as a debtor nation, owing more to European creditors than they owed to it. It emerged as the world's largest creditor nation, with the Allies owing the United States approximately $10 billion in war debts. New York had replaced London as the financial capital of the world. And at the center of this new financial order sat the Federal Reserve, the institution that those 6 men had sketched out on Jekyll Island just 7 years before the first shots were fired. The shift was seismic. Before the war, when foreign governments needed to raise capital, they went to London. After the war, they came to New York. The dollar, backed by the Federal Reserve's growing gold reserves and its expanding balance sheet, began its long ascent toward becoming the world's reserve currency. The war had accelerated a transfer of global financial power from the old world to the new, and the Federal Reserve was both the instrument and the beneficiary of that transfer. The men from Jekyll Island hadn't just created a central bank. They had, whether they fully intended it or not, created the financial foundation for American global dominance in the 20th century. The Liberty Bonds themselves had an enduring impact beyond war financing. They introduced millions of ordinary Americans to the concept of financial securities for the first time. People who had never owned a stock or a bond in their lives now held government paper. Roughly half of all American families purchased war bonds, many of them in denominations as small as $50, financed through installment plans or even 25-cent savings stamps that children pasted onto collection cards. This democratization of investment would eventually help fuel the speculative boom of the 1920s, which Warburg himself warned against in March 1929, just months before the crash that would validate his fears and usher in the Great Depression. By then, the Federal Reserve had proven that it was not the stabilizing force its creators had promised. Its policies in the late 1920s, including its failure to restrain speculative lending, contributed to the bubble. And its response to the crash, raising interest rates and contracting the money supply, turned a financial panic into the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. The institution born from the desire to prevent panics had, in its first major test outside of wartime, made the panic worse. But even that failure didn't diminish the power of the system. If anything, each crisis made the Federal Reserve more central to the functioning of the American and global economies. Each crisis expanded its mandate, enlarged its toolkit, and deepened its integration into the machinery of government and commerce. The men on Jekyll Island had built something more durable than they probably imagined, an institution that would outlast the gold standard, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and the rise and fall of countless financial innovations. And maybe that durability is the most telling thing of all. The Federal Reserve has survived for over 100 years, not because it is perfect, and not because its origins were noble, but because it serves a function that no other institution can replicate. It is the lender of last resort, the issuer of the world's reserve currency, and the single most important actor in the global financial system. For better or worse, it is the engine that drives the machinery of modern capitalism. But every time you hear the Federal Reserve announce a rate decision, every time you see the markets swing on the words of the Fed chair, it's worth remembering how it all started. 6 men on a private island, fake names, a borrowed shotgun, and a plan written in secret that would reshape the financial destiny of the world. One thing that always stays with me about this story is the idea that the most consequential decisions often happen in the quietest rooms, not in the halls of Congress, not in front of cameras, but behind closed doors, among people whose names most of us will never know. The Federal Reserve wasn't born from a grand public debate. It was born from a private conversation among men who believed that they knew best, that the system they were building would serve everyone, even if no one was invited to weigh in on its design. And whether you think the Federal Reserve is a necessary institution or a dangerous concentration of power, or some complicated mixture of both, the question that Jekyll Island really forces us to ask is this. In a democracy, who gets to decide how money works? Who gets to design the systems that govern our economic lives? And if the answer is a small group of private interests operating in secret, what does that say about the system we're living in? That's a question worth sitting with, because the decisions being made in quiet rooms today, by people whose names you don't know, are shaping the world you'll wake up in tomorrow. And if the story of Jekyll Island teaches us anything, it's that the consequences of those decisions can echo for a very, very long time. If you've stayed to the very end of this one, leave a $sign and a ghost emoji in the comments, the $sign for the money and the ghost for the secrets. I'd love to see how many of you made it through. And if this is the kind of deep dive content you enjoy, please subscribe to the channel. We're pushing hard toward our next milestone, and your support genuinely makes a difference. I'll see you in the next one.